We are very lucky to be here to do our now annual podcast with athletic writer Dan Brown to discuss the Hall of Fame news as we have our two new introductions. We'll be discussing the election of Andruw Jones and Carlos Beltran, so we're very excited to be doing that today. And with a bit of baseball news, both of the New York teams settled their center field issues this week, you could say, with the Mets making a trade that would make most people go, that was it? To get Luis Robert, who
Or
was on
Robert,
the
it's
down.
actually Luis. It's actually Luis Robert. I always want to say Robert too, but
I've
actually,
heard it that way,
I,
so
I
I just.
it's
So the
yes,
Mets solved their issues there. The Yankees get back Bellinger on a big deal. Bellinger with opt outs, but he's getting his $150 million contract. And with that, most of the big name free agent, at least hitters, are off the board now, ladies and gentlemen. It's down to where Framber Valdez goes.
right. So well, obviously, this podcast will drop on Monday. So this news happened on Wednesday, the week prior, and you're going to get a huge snowstorm there. I don't know if you know this weekend, like 15 inches of snow
Oracle. Yeah.
back east. But it's a little bit old news, except that Luis Robert, news came in on the heels of the Mets losing out on some of the other players, and they had to do something about center field. And I think the Mets are better positioned today actually than they were last year. Remember who they had in center field starting last season? It
Uh,
was, it was the Met
Jose Siri.
combination. Jose
There's Jose
Siri
Siri.
and still Taylor, right? Tyrone
Right,
Taylor,
right. But Taylor's now squarely back to his fourth outfield. This takes a ton of pressure off of
right?
bench. You're not looking at an outfield where you had potentially two really young guys
Bench can play
starting.
left field.
You might even be able to get away with putting Beatty out there for a little bit of the year because Robert plays very good defensive center field. You don't want him to have to compensate too much for Soto and Beatty. But just as a note, one of the people on the roster that people were talking about how the Mets got Bichette and will he be a good third baseman? Well, their infield coach is Kai Correa, who in some respects is credited for turning J.D. Davis into what would some people consider a passable defensive third baseman. Because there was an interesting stat when J.D. Davis' first year of the team in 2012, in 27 games, he managed to put out 3 outs under -3 outs above average, or I guess average. Like he was somehow miraculously bad in like a short period of play. The next year when he played third base for the Mets most of the year, he was actually like a league
Right.
average defender. So something, and Correa's gotten a lot of credit for being somebody that can teach people how to play the position. So you hope that he can work his magic with Bichette at third, because when you look at this Mets team as just, a final Mets notes before we probably hop in with Dan in a moment, this is a team that's going to strike out less. They're going to put the bat on the ball more, and they're going to field their positions better, which was a big issue with them last year. They had a lineup of guys that struck out a ton, and we saw that constantly end up killing rallies, and they hit into a ton of double plays. So I think less strikeouts and less double plays from that lineup was a big thing they were trying to fix this offseason.
Yeah, I think it's the upside is there. We don't know what you're going to get from Robert, but I think they're better than they were going into last season, at least in center field. At first base, not so much, right? Because okay, you did what you did, but now you're like, okay, we lost our first base. The Yankees got Bellinger, so he won't be playing first base for the Mets.
We got to do that though.
And right once the Mets signed Robert before the Yankees signed Bellinger, so they had to know that they weren't.
Right, they were never in on Bellinger. Look, and if you're a Met fan, really, well, how much better is Robert than what we had last year? Last year, the Mets center fielders put up staggeringly bad numbers. Like you really have to look at it. They were like 220 with like a sub 750 OPS.
They're going to be better this year just because it's hard to be that bad 2 years in a row.
He's going to play borderline Gold Glove defense in center field. He has the pop at a bare minimum to hit 220 homers. The real question is he going to be the guy that we saw the last couple of years who had awful stats everywhere else? Or do you look at some of the stuff and say, hey, he was in a light White Sox lineup with no protection and realistically no hope to really compete? And you hope that, he had some pretty bad BABIP luck last year. And he still has the bat speed. You hope he can. He's the prime kind of guy for a bounce back year here in New York, where he goes from being the guy in Chicago to being another guy on this team. Nobody's expecting anything from him here.
He's the Kyle Tucker of the Mets. No, that's not true. I don't mean that.
Even Met fans can't go that far.
And the Mets today also signed here on Wednesday former Astros starter Luis Garcia, who oft injured would be. He had the fantastic rookie year, and then he really hasn't been on the field very much because he keeps getting injured. So that's a depth signing and a hope signing that he's going to
Right.
be something like an instant.
It's a cheaper flyer than trading for Sandy Alcantara. That's kind
I
of how
hope
I
they're
look
not
at
done
that.
with that yet, but we'll see about those things.
The Marlins don't have any interest in giving them up. The Marlins offseason moves really, other than the deal of Cabrera, which I think you could make a lot of arguments that they probably sold. If you selling on him now was the
They
right
sold high,
play,
yeah.
right? Because he was one bad half season away from being basically untradeable asset. So I think that was the right move from them. And you go, okay, you know what? We showed some signs of life last year. Who knows if we trade him before the year, you're basically throwing up the white flag before it begins, and I think they don't want that.
So we're going to introduce Dan here, and he's going to jump on behind us. And he is an editor at the Athletic and a writer, and just somebody that we've gotten to spend a little time with every year for this Hall of Fame recap. And hope you enjoy it. And thanks. It's coming right up. So we're happy that Daniel Brown from The Athletic has joined us again. This is year number 3, and if you haven't noticed, Dan, this is kind of becoming a habit. I guess you like it because you keep coming back.
Yeah, I want to do the Cal Ripken thing and come like 2,000 plus times.
That's cool. We'll have to do a
That'd be fun.
podcast
An
every day. That'll take too
institution.
long. 7 years of podcasts. So yeah, we're here to talk about the Hall of Fame. The votes came in. We're recording on Wednesday. This is going to drop the following Monday. On Tuesday, and I'll let you talk about what your votes and obviously how you came to it. But as a fan and watcher of this, and I don't know about you, Gordon, it ended up being a little boring because we had the track of Beltran and Carlos Beltran and Andruw Jones. Congratulations to them both. They got in, and we kind of knew. And so when it got announced, to me, it was a little anticlimactic, and I don't know that anybody else feels that way. That's how it hit me a little bit.
That is, I mean, I love Ryan Thibodeau on the Hall of Fame tracker, and I think it's a blast every year, especially when it's got a couple guys who are like on the fringes and or if they're in their last year, the drama kind of builds, and it's sometimes can generate the excitement. In this case, yeah, it was some candidates that there was such, I want to say, kind of a split enthusiasm for. So I don't know, even if it had come out of nowhere, if you hadn't seen the trade, if people would have had, be doing cartwheels upon the election day. I will say, not to not to set things on an opening bad note, but I'm sick of the bad notes. Every
Yeah.
Hall of Fame announcement come out, and people are mad. And I read our coverage, the Athletics coverage this morning. Tyler Kepner wrote a great story about Beltran and Andruw.
Oh, they killed him.
Oh, and then Jason Stark weighed in, and the comment section was anger, which I get the fact that these are, as with everything now, it seems to be a controversial choice. But there's that moment that I remember the Hall of Fame being of like, oh, so great, Orlando Cepeda's been inducted, or oh, Ferguson Jenkins made it, or whatever happiness and joy that came from Hall of Fame announcement day. It's annually for the 3 years we've been doing this. It's annually the source of at least some kind of hand-wringing anger, and even when somebody like Ichiro would all great sails in, the debate is like, well, who's the jackass who
One
didn't?
guy who
We focus on that one guy instead of this Ichiro's achievement and career, and he's had the highest voting in the history of baseball, and people are mad. And I don't know how to avoid it. But my one thing, because you talk about the tracker, I have considered, is it better to not share the voting, even the percentages, until after induction day? In other sports, we never know. In football, you don't know. You get 75.6%, and he's up from 54%. We just know they're Hall of Famers, and there's some sense of joy and be mad later once they're inducted. Keeping the focus on the achievements of these athletes. And I know, it's probably going to be avoidable because of, especially the Beltran being such a lightning rod for the sign stealing. There was never going to be a parade in the streets. But man, it's just a trend that I would like to figure out a way to end.
and Beltran, just with Beltran's controversy, it feels so, especially because the Hall of Fame, he got put in for being a player. And a lot of almost all of his controversy is stuff that happened after his playing career was over. So it really feels like people are just kind of waiting for that to like take their shots at the guy. When it's just like, okay, I understand that there was controversy, I won't deny it, but like as far as he goes as a player, this one was pretty much a slam dunk in most people's minds. So it feels like controversy almost for controversy's sake.
Well, on that note, if you look at the comment section, which I don't generally advise that you do, but they get announced and you look at the thing and it's like, what about Whitaker? What about where's Garvey? Why is Harold?
Same old.
You're gonna find a reason to be. Everybody's mad about everything all the time, and individually, I think all those uh, grievances that people might have, there's some validity to them. I don't dismiss them. I just think there should be one day where we can celebrate the achievements of great players. And
I think you're onto something when you say that maybe we just don't publicize the votes. 84% I think of the votes are going to end up being public. I looked that up before, something like that. So most of them are public, and I think that overall is better for the process. I'll let you as a voter determine. Tell me how you feel about that. But I think that we could wait because you're right. We would just celebrate the wow, Andruw Jones finally made it in, and he was an amazing center fielder, and Beltran was a terrific player. And then then a day or two later, how is that going to ruin the process by having people know it after the fact instead of all along knowing what's in, arguing about it in a bizarre way that had nothing to do with what actually happened?
It's as I say, it's kind of like we've come the other way. Like back in the day, I feel like you would have never talked about some of these things about these players because of like you wouldn't ruin the prestige of the moment by bringing up these things that are these darker aspects of their careers and stuff. And so aspects and parts of their story wouldn't be told because we wouldn't do that here. But it feels like we've almost pivoted from that to almost the complete other way, where no, we got to make sure all we talk about are the bad stuff, and we can't ever celebrate these guys as players because well, remember that one time they did something we really didn't like. So it is only truly the most pure players. You're down to celebrating Derek Jeter, and even people took shots at him. People took shots at Mariano Rivera and Ichiro. Who's left if you get celebrate those guys?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a voting dynamic or if it's a societal shift because we kind of do this in general. I don't know what role social media has played because you can have an argument all the time, every day with anybody you want. But this notion of like it being a joyous thing, it rarely is. And I don't know how we restore that. I mean, I think induction day is generally pretty true. I think by the time we get there, it's a true celebration and people get their due and all that stuff. But it just people want to be mad at the writers and but this whole notion of like player X gets elected and then half the comments are why not player Y Z F and I'm a big Whitaker fan myself like but it just kind of came out of nowhere like well he wasn't on the ballot that that committee has already made its ruling. This isn't the time to like pick that fight. But we do. And here I am saying we should be more positive and I'm talking about all the negative stuff. But I do think that it's a disappointing to see that, I wonder if when Ted Williams got elected, if people were mad, like, why were the 15 people who didn't vote for him, which because he wasn't either.
Remember Ichiro last year when he got up and he talked about the one guy liked to buy him a beer? Yeah. And I thought to myself, Ichiro drinks beer? So that was my takeaway from that. Yeah. I didn't know that. So everybody in the Athletic who wrote and has votes, they publicized their votes, and so let's talk about your votes. And I think they're much the same as they were last year with a couple of changes, and I'll name them. You voted for 10, which we're in favor of. Bobby Abreu, Beltran, Mark Burley, Felix Hernandez, Andruw Jones, Andy Pettitte, Manny Ramirez, Alex Rodriguez, Jimmy Rollins, and Chase Utley. And 3 Phillies in there. I'm sure that was not done with any intent, but it is kind of interesting that ended up being part of the equation.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. That was because that could have been that Jimmy Rollins vote could have been Dustin Pedroia vote. Mm-hmm. And maybe I found this year to be the hardest year to vote in my. I haven't been voting forever, but whatever 5-6 years of voting, I found this year to be hardest hardest year, in part because there wasn't the slam dunk choices. There wasn't. I like to be consistent. If I vote for this guy and somebody else is similar, that's what got me in trouble a little bit. I shouldn't say in trouble. What made it harder is I read a compelling case for Felix Hernandez that
Hmm.
Mike Petrello wrote for MLB.com that more or less that for their 10-year stretch, he was the best pitcher in the majors for that 10-year stretch, which to me is a kind of a definition of a Hall of Famer. You're the best at your job for a 10-year stretch, for a decade-long stretch. That's a pretty good mark of a Hall of Famer. So I decided after reading that, yeah, I'm going to vote for him, and I hadn't last year. I hadn't, and you loved him as a player, but I didn't vote for him last year. But then it's tough. You vote for him, and Pettit has a way better WAR. Hamels has a better lifetime ERA plus. There was a kind of a cluster. Those pitchers were kind of, if you look at things like WAR, OPS, or ERA plus, all the career marks are pretty similar. I also look at the WAR 7 that gives you a look at
Yep.
their peak years, and maybe Burley wasn't quite as high on that list, but he had some other things going in his favor. So it's hard to vote for one and not all. So I ran out of room for Hamels, which would have been yet another Philly, but I'll vote for him next year. And by then I did the thing where I went to the tracker and saw that Hamels was going to safely cross the threshold for the 5%, because otherwise I might have voted no, because you need to know that, because we've made mistakes as the voting body. We've made mistakes and not given more people more time on the ballot, i.e. Kenny Lofton. Making sure they advance.
Yeah. That's a voter's responsibility when you think about it, if you really want to make sure that, people get considered and not pass like, and so if you didn't have the tracker out there, you wouldn't know that necessarily,
Yeah.
and you might have to approach it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. So by then, because I voted fairly late in the state, so it was pretty well established that he was comfortably going to pass. So that allowed me to get the guys like Burley, who I also didn't vote for last year. But I just think as we reevaluate starting pitchers, which is the argument, I think another year doesn't hurt to figure out, like, okay, how good was he when we know what we know now about the numbers and the way the role of the starting pitcher has evolved. Some of that's going to go away because guys who are no doubt Hall of Famers, Kershaw, Verlander, or Scherzer, they're not that far off from making it easy. But that group that we're talking about, that's a tough one for me to check the box or not. Where are you guys on those pitchers?
Well, I think you raise a really good point there, because if you're going to sit there and make the argument that, Felix Hernandez, who I do think deserves to belong in the Hall of Fame, well, it's like he's not, like, there isn't something that statistically sets him apart from Burley, from Hamels, that you could point to and be like, he's so much definitively better in this one aspect than them. So then it kind of just, if I'm not going to go off of that, it kind of becomes a vibes thing where I'm just like, well, I just feel like Felix Hernandez was better than those guys, and that's not really a methodology based approach. And so if I'm gonna say Hernandez deserves to be in, the other guys kind of creep into the argument where I have to be willing to put them in too. Otherwise, I'm kind of all over the place. I'm kind of in lockstep there with you, where I'm like, and it fits with expanding the Hall, because when you look at those guys, we really are talking about the best pitchers of that era, and maybe that's kind of on our fault for for trying to evaluate them on the best pitchers from a previous era.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, and then I guess they're all kind of a little after Clemens, but yeah, it's starting that it's going to be a thing for a while when you're not going to have 300 wins, but you're not going to have a ton of innings. You might not have another 3,000 strikeout guy, like all these little benchmarks that
you won't have like 6 20-game seasons or anything like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Certain, especially a lot of career collection statistics, like 3,000 strikeouts, the kind of thing. Like, guys unlikely to get to that purely on the basis of he's just not going to have the opportunities to strike out 3,000 guys across his career. Yeah. But you're going to be able to look at a guy like, here's going to be a guy when he retires who he's not going to have the career stats. Chris Sale. Chris Sale is probably going to retire with the highest K per nine of like any starting pitcher ever. And he'd be the kind of guy who was like, okay, well, if he pitched at a different time, and his arm doesn't fall off, he's going to get 3,000 strikeouts.
Yeah, and he might be the last guy. I mean, he literally might be the last guy ever to do it.
Mhm.
And Zach Greinke's another guy we don't talk about in that same vein of guys who, like, the his career, when you stack him up against the guys we're talking about, Burley and Andy Pettit, if you're asking me my opinion, I think Greinke was better than those guys.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too.
Okay.
I think he'll get it. Writers tend to like him, so I
Yeah,
think
well,
for as weird
yeah,
as he was, I think he.
That's why they like. I mean, let's put it this way: when Greinke gets put in, there are going to be some amazing
Oh
pieces
yeah,
written
sure.
about him.
Yeah,
He's such a character
yeah,
that there's no way he's not going to have, and he's going to have a very interesting speech if he gets in. I'm sure of it.
Dan, you were onto something when you talked about the fact that those three pitchers kind of like if you got one, you got to have all three. And I think your colleague Jason Stark kind of advanced that the way voting is going. When you think about the fact that Chase Utley got such love shown to him this
hmm
year, and anybody that's had the raise in what his Hall of Fame vote percentage was is going to get in. Basically, he is on that path now that
yeah,
for eventual enshrinement based upon the increase he's gotten, early in his voting. But that allows guys with fewer games played, fewer at bats, all kinds of stuff to be considered. Where we've heretofore, I mean, David Wright actually has a chance. I'm a Met fan. I love David Wright, but I never really thought he had any chance at all with
yeah.
the sort of brevity and lack of counting stats. That all of a sudden the groundswell for the younger voters, it seems like what we're hearing, they're more willing to not look at things as traditionally as prior veteran voters might.
Yeah, I mean those younger generation. I don't know if they look at counting stats at all. If you said, I mean, Rollins. I mean, is it Utley who's got around 1,500 hits? I don't even know the number, but it's not.
Less than 2,000 by a lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is, but if you look at the WAR and you factor in his defense and his base running and all this stuff and the position he plays, he stacks up pretty well. You look at those numbers and it's a pretty easy case. I love that. I love the Jaws number that puts you can compare people from the second from the similar position and look at their stats and how they stack up against other second basemen or other shortstops. And Utley's I can't remember off the top of my head, but like 13th, and I think the 13th best second baseman in Major League history should probably be in the Hall of Fame. As should Whitaker for anybody who's yelling at the screen.
Yeah.
I'll just say that periodically throughout the podcast. But uh yeah, no, the trend in voting, and it's already different. You look at different numbers because you have to, and that's the one thing as somebody who's of a certain age is tricky for me to look at a player I thought I knew by a different lens. Like, I don't remember him being that good. And, from not that he's the classic example, but Abreu's a guy I never thought, hey, I took my kid to see Bobby Abreu, and I don't even have kids. But if I did, uh, you'd say, like, oh, you saw DiMaggio, you saw Williams, we saw Bonds. Seeing Bobby Abreu, you wouldn't, that's not destination viewing. But then you look at the numbers in a vacuum without the crowd, without the whatever, and look at and he stacks up. He's up there with Winfield and Parker and
Yep.
Vladimir Guerrero and all these things. And so, which is right? uh, how you remember him and whether he was a Hall of Fame with the emphasis on fame, or how does he stack up statistically with other similar players,
Or both.
or both?
Right. And you might run into an issue where, like, Bobby Abreu's biggest issue might have been when he played in that. If you weren't somebody that watched the Phillies every day, you could still generally watch Bobby Abreu and get a sense of what he was like as a player.
Mhm.
When you talk about players from back in the day, you only understood a lot of them through what you read in the paper, what you
Yeah,
heard. So it allowed the mythology of the players to grow to a
yeah,
much higher degree.
yeah,
Whereas even I, who was somebody that grew up at the time, not a Philly fan, I know who Bobby Abreu was as a player. I saw him play enough. I remember what he was good at. I remember what he was, I at least have a perception of him. But if somebody told me, imagine, Lou Gehrig as a player, I only know what's been
yeah,
told to me. So I only really know the legend of,
yeah.
of him. So it's, you relate to these players very differently. So I think it's become much easier when you talk about those old guys to
Mhm.
lionize them in a much greater
Yeah.
way than where Bobby Abreu, you know what he is, and that was a damn good baseball player.
Yeah.
Yeah. Abreu, Abreu was so good at so many things, but not exceptional at any one thing.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways he was as smooth as Beltran in the way he conducted his business on the field. And so that hurt Beltran a little bit, because I remember Willie Randolph, when he was managing the Mets, going, well, I don't think Carlos necessarily is that fast a runner until I see the numbers on the fence going by when he's running to go catch a fly ball. And
Yeah.
they're going by really fast. So I guess he is running fast. And so he had that effortless style, and both Abreu did as well. And so it's hard when you're a right fielder, right? In a center field, it's a little easier
Yeah.
to do that. But if you're a right fielder now, unless you've got a cannon for an arm who can cut down guys all the time, just being a good right fielder and being a good average hitter and good stolen bases and a good home run guy and a
Yeah.
good on base guy, it's like, yeah, that's great, but where's the pizzazz?
Yeah. There's that, which so then it's this loophole, because wormhole, whatever, because you go like, okay, well, if we understood the stats then as we did now, he might have been a star in his time. Certainly all the seam heads would have known, like, hey, Bobby Bray is incredibly valuable. But
Right.
for me, it was more in retrospect. I'm like, yeah, that guy was pretty valuable. But I didn't. I was at a game where he hit the inside the park game walk-off home run against the Giants uh, in Philadelphia. But that's kind of the only memory I have of Bobby Abreu. Home run derby, I guess. But he's not the guy you would have his poster on your wall.
And I think to your point, I think that's the kind of guy, when you look at the stats, you have to go, oh, wait a second, maybe I'm not seeing this the way that it really was. This guy was so consistent at such a high level that has to count, which is why I would include him as well for the same reason. And he had the length to his career. He had enough, he had enough counting stats. So I think. Yeah.
I think that's why a guy like Beltran, people were finally like, wait a second, what are we doing here? Because when you looked at the full breadth of the career and what he did, he's a Hall of Famer. I think people just really didn't want to give it to him as a first ballot kind of thing. So he was held back by that. And now, I mean, when you look at his career, kind of like you said before, Beltran in a lot of ways paves the way for Bobby Abreu, because Beltran was just, you don't want to say this about somebody, he was almost like the better version of Bobby Abreu.
No, that's a good, yeah, for sure. I mean, I wrote down Sarah Langs was on fire yesterday with some great stats. But the only players with 400 homers, 300 stolen bases are Barry Bonds, Andre Dawson, Willie Mays, and Carlos Beltran. It's good company to keep. The highest postseason OPS: Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth, Albert Pujols, Carlos Beltran.
That's good company.
That's a good list to be on.
And then he had the highest stolen base percentage, which I didn't know. Better than Reigns.
Yeah, 86%, for his career. And it wasn't like he stole, 20 bases,
Yeah, right.
He stole bases regularly.
Right.
So, yeah, I think, and his counterpart, Andruw Jones, let me just talk about him for a second. It just seemed to me for the longest time that he wasn't going to get in. I just kind of felt like, people are going to ding him for those last 5 years. And by the way, they were nomadic in addition to being, not good. I didn't realize, that he played for 5 teams after he left, Atlanta.
Was it Dodgers? I can't remember.
Dodgers. It was Dodgers, Rangers, White Sox, and then he finished up with 2 years with the Yankees.
Not playing very much.
Correct. He had his best year of that group with the White Sox. He actually had an okay year with them, probably because he had put up 1.9 WAR. But all the other seasons after he left Atlanta were less than 1 WAR. So he did not play well after that. But
from a voter's perspective, had Jones retired after 12 years with the Braves,
yeah,
I'm done. I've done my career and never played anywhere else. Does he get in sooner?
Yeah. I mean, especially if you had some kind of like a Kirby Puckett thing where it was like some kind of you could have some compassion for the circumstances instead of just like flaming out. But kind of probably the same thing with Dale Murphy too. If you'd only had some sad sack case, but instead of a natural aging curve. But yeah, Andruw Jones, 10 Gold Gloves, 400 plus homers.
That's enough.
Maybe the best defensive center fielder ever. Willie Mays himself. I mean, Dave O'Brien, or one of our, he just retired, but he covered the Braves for many years for the Athletic. Was behind the cage, and Mays came up and said, Andruw Jones is the best defensive center fielder I've ever seen. So Willie Mays says I feel comfortable clicking that box. And he didn't even get 8% of the vote his first year on the ballot. It's an
Right.
incredible rise for him.
And he felt like a guy that so much of like he was a guy that was being punished by the old way of looking at players, of being like, oh, he didn't have the career average that we wanted him to have. Like, oh, because I think his career average is pretty bad actually when you look at it. But when you look at all of his other statistics, when you look at everything else, that he's a career 250 hitter. And I feel like, well, there are a lot of Hall of Fame voters that are like, I don't want to put a career 250 hitter into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
But that really overlooks what he was like as a player. And in some ways, one of the first guys to really be a 3 true outcome kind of hitter, and that he was going to hit the ball, he was going to strike out or hit the ball a long way a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But unlike a lot of the other guys that profiled it as that type of hitter, he did something that virtually none of them ever do, which is play elite defense. And he did that at a premium position to play elite defense.
So again, I steal from Sarah Langs, but 400 homers, 10 gold gloves. It's Andruw Jones, then Willie Mays, Ken Griffey, Mike Schmidt, end of list.
Yeah.
Check the box.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before with you. You know, Gordon and I we have one of our early podcasts was about 36 players we'd put in the Hall of Fame right now. Because if you put in something like that, it doesn't matter how many, 30, 40, something like that. Well, the guys we'd be arguing about would be much more interesting. Right.
Yeah.
And that's who I want. I want to argue about Pedroia. Like, oh, was it long enough? I love this player, and he did so much. And he's a guy whose contribution supersedes his numbers. And you have to be able to use both, you know, the statistical aspect as well as I watched the guy play. That dude looked like a Hall of Famer when he was playing.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of a little of a side note, but I looked this up before the podcast because it was an odd ballot, right? It's not star-studded, but you've got a lot of, I mean, you see the line a lot in Twitter and comments, the Hall of Very Good, oh, he's Hall of Very Good, he's Hall of Very Good. And then, you know, they're not great because everybody's comparing these candidates to Koufax, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio. So this wasn't a class of DiMaggio, Walter Johnson, Mickey Mantle, but it was a class of Stan Kovaleski, Red Faber, Burley Grimes, Epper Rixey, Harry Hooper, Ross Youngs, Travis Jackson. All of those are Hall of Famers. It's the same, you know, they are in the same company as Ted Williams and Sandy Koufax. There are Hall of Famers who are not as top tier.
Renowned, yeah.
But this is the group. This is a group that's kind of like all those guys, but you have to weigh them on their own merits and not against Ruth and Garrett, because nobody would ever get in again.
Because it's not the Hall of Ruth, it's not the Hall of Lou Gehrig, it's the Hall of Fame. You don't have to. Not every player. You can't set the standard of be the greatest player to ever play the game to get into the Hall of Fame, because then only one guy can ever be in there at a time.
I will grant that there are some dubious selections throughout the history of the Hall of Fame, but that's the point. Is these votes are not ruining the Hall of Fame. These votes are not watering down the Hall of Fame. It has always been kind of a tiered system where there's different variations of Hall of Famers, but that doesn't mean we should stop voting for great players. These guys were great players. So this Hall of Very Good thing, I get the concept, because there is a line at some point, but it's a kind of a disservice to guys whose statistical records and playing career match up, not just like in the position, but very favorable or even better than some of the current Hall of Famers.
You know, our podcast at one point we thought about calling it the Hall of Very Good, but we didn't. We went for almost Cooperstown, and it's a better, you know, because we don't want to sort of jump on that ship about, you know, these guys. You know, we want to talk about the marginal cases, and we have to that we think kind of should be in, because as I keep saying, 274 players I think now in the Hall of Fame, maybe 276 with these two out of 23,000. It's 1.2% of all players who ever played. If you added 30 players in, it would go to 1.3%. That doesn't ruin the Hall of Fame.
Doesn't ruin the Hall of Fame. Yeah.
And that's what all that talk is about. You know, that you're going to ruin it by watering it down from people who never go to the Hall of Fame themselves. By the way, those people aren't even going there.
Yeah, and like I say, I get it. There are guys that I think are had great careers and are below my line, But the fair thing to do is look who's in by the standards that have close to 100 years of uh, uh,
Hmm.
similar cases, case studies. You can look, does this fit in this company or not? And I think the players got elected yesterday do.
Yep. And next year's vote's going to be different because you finally got Manny off the ballot. Since you were never going to vote the guy in the first place, then unfortunately, the same thing seems to be happening with A-Rod. Pettit may have worked himself out of that now a little bit with some of the way I'm guessing the younger voters are looking at what happened with him comparatively. But you're going to have only really Buster Posey is going to probably be the only surefire, and I don't know if he should be a first ballot Hall of Famer, but we can talk about that another time. But he's the new guy in the ballot next year that's going to sort of take some of the opportunities away from other guys that are moving up the ladder. But maybe like Pettit had 46% this year. Is Felix going to get up there next year because he's there?
The two guys coming off the ballot because you have Beltran and Jones who got elected. So that's two guys on there that were taking up votes. Manny's coming off of it, and he got 40%. That's a lot of votes that just got freed up. And as you said, the only guy coming on next year that's really going to accrue any kind of sizable vote portion is Buster Posey. And maybe John Lester, just because people like him a lot. I don't see him as a really serious Hall of Fame candidate, but I think he'll do better than people expect. But a lot of other guys on that list are, really strong candidates. So that's going to bump up some of the other numbers here just because you got to vote for some guys.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the one thing. My vision of being a Hall of Fame voter is like, oh, I'm going to vote for the Hall of Famers, which at heart I do. But sometimes you're voting to keep the guy on the ballot, or you're voting to give him momentum. Your vote is not going to decide whether he's in or out because so many of these guys, it's been about these recent cases show it's about building momentum, getting some traction, getting talked about more, getting more people looking harder at your case, and that sometimes is what a vote is good for. Is not to get the bronze plaque ready. It's to like get them another year of consideration.
Right, take one more. I mean, look at how we change our opinions as we look at this, guys, because it's one thing to look at a guy's career numbers in isolation, but as we get better and better at, statistically comparing these guys, all of a sudden, when you look at a guy in relation to his own peers, you start getting a better idea of who he actually was. And you start pulling some of those stats and being like, okay, yeah, Andruw Jones is one of only like 5 guys that had hit 400 home runs and won 10 Gold Gloves. Everybody else that did it is also in the Hall of Fame. So when you start being able to look at stuff like that and going, okay, wait a second, we really do have proof that some of these guys are great that you can't necessarily get in just one off season of looking at just their own career stat page in isolation.
For sure.
And the two guys elected are, and I this was written this morning. Maybe it was in Jason Stark's column. The 9th and the 10th center fielders elected to the Hall of Fame in the history of baseball. And when I think only 10 center fielders are in the Hall of Fame in the history of baseball, that just sounds crazy in and of itself to me.
Wait, I don't think that's right. 9th and 10th center fielders?
Yes.
So we just did I think it may be there was the Athletic Chad Jennings did a really good story on the dearth of center fielders in the Hall of Fame and noted my memories is something like 22 of the 24 center fielders in the Hall of Fame were selected before 1950 or debuted before 1952. And it's only Griffey and Puckett maybe who have done it since. So there's more, I think.
Maybe I misread it, and maybe it's guys with 400 home runs. I don't know if there's
maybe
yeah, I don't know.
Dan, you are right. There are 24 center fielders in the Hall of Fame, but I think what you were seeing there, Dad, is the same thing that you're seeing, and that the vast majority of them, I would say, played their careers before 1950.
Yeah,
like there's this weird gap that all of a sudden where you go, and like when I look at the recent players, and I am sure there is going to be somebody on this list who I just don't recognize, but when I'm looking at these names, the only guys that I'm really aware of like that played during my time of being alive were Puckett, now Andruw Jones, Ken Griffey Jr., Andre Dawson, and Beltran. Those 5 guys. And maybe there's like a couple other players, but I'm not recognizing a lot of other contemporary names on this list. So you're looking at a lot of much older ball players. So what's happened in that time period where now we've only gotten 5 guys in, and why has it dropped off so much at such a premium position in baseball?
Yeah, so Chad Jennings did a pretty good story on this, and he talked to Fred Lynn, and he talked to Torrey Hunter, and he talked to can't remember, just some other center fielders who had kind of maybe on a Hall of Fame trajectory at one point in their careers. And Lynn, for example, said, "Look, you get injured a lot playing center field. You bang into walls all the time. You're covering a ton of ground. The advent of the designated hitter allowed teams to move a corner outfielder to DH, and then maybe somebody who was playing center can now play right or left instead to protect their bat. So it's an interesting. I mean, it's just stunning. It's one of those things. The reason the number was in my head is because I looked at it 20 times. Like what? Only I think we didn't count Dawson because there must be some kind of.
I don't think he was primarily a center fielder, as was in my opinion. I
Yeah.
thought he played right field more than he played center.
So on that count, it was another. That's another reason. And that, like, hey, let's celebrate the center fielders who are stood the test of time and
I think
and we haven't even talked about Kenny Lofton, which you always have to have your Kenny Lofton mention when we talk
Yeah.
about a guy who's.
I mean, he's the Kenny Lofton's the biggest reason. If I have any hesitation, if I got anything, I will vote for them because to keep them on the ballot, because Lofton coming and going is a disgrace.
I wanted to ask you this, Dan. The the era committees, I should say, right, that do that look at veterans and so on and so forth. We have younger voters now in the BBWA that seem to be changing the way voting is looked at, and the way that I see changes. But the committee era voters are older and are probably still holding to the same feelings they've had about PEDs and things that they've had all the time. So I don't know that these players who are hoping for another shot on these committees, it's going to be a long time for that. I don't know how you feel about that and the responsibility there.
Well, that's really interesting because I looked at there's a number of players on the former players on the committee and former Hall of Fame players on that committee. So you always wonder, like, hey, what do players think about? What do Hall of Fame players think about the PED guys? And it's been resounding. It's come up enough times. It's been a resounding no support, and it almost changed. And probably should the way I voted this year on the PED. Like, if they don't want them, who am I to say these guys should go into your hall? Like, I think they're probably at this point not just voting for themselves and their opinion, but representing my presumption would be they're representing some kind of Hall of Fame consensus among the players. Like, we don't want our hall to include these players. I don't think it's individual. And so, Joe Morgan and others more or less said as much. But the fact that they're getting no support shows it doesn't look like they're even divided among themselves. So I find that a little bit informative about I would be curious to see because I voted for Bonds, and I have said on this podcast before, I struggle with the PED argument. Anyone who sees a clear cut, I don't. I mean, there's a rampant lawless era. I hate the fact that some of the record books have been cheated. I hate the fact that everything got inflated, not just for these Hall of Fame candidates, but across the board. All the numbers got way, way, way out of whack in a way that players who were playing clean probably really suffered during that time. And like financially, they're not getting the contracts because they're choosing to not use. Anyway, it was a whole messy era that I don't want to pretend like a condone. I just think it's hard as a Hall of Fame voter to play judge and jury after the fact. So I hold my nose and vote. So what was I getting at? I don't think those guys are going to change. I think
Right.
I just think that the players seem to be representing some kind of code among the Hall of Famers. Like, nah, let's keep it.
And there's nuance there that I think is, as I talk about Andy Pettit a lot, because as I recall, it was before, obviously, there was a testing program in place, but his use of, and he admitted his HGH use, I believe, was in order to get back on the field more quickly, right? And so that he could play. And so the guy who's taking that kind of stuff to do it for those reasons, and I'm going to guess that most of the folks were doing it just so they could continue to play and all that. It wasn't, I'm hoping to get an extra 5 feet on my home run ball so I can hit an extra 50 home runs in my career and make the Hall of Fame. So I always look at it from that standpoint, going, well, you have to look at the intent here, and if it's before this current, what we have in place now, which I'm much more, I'm okay with people. Look, if anybody after it, if you did it, then you're dead to me. Okay, I don't agree with that, and not everybody does, but at least it's a point of view that I can appreciate. Because it's
Sure.
clear. Everything else is cloudy before that. And how do you know who did and who didn't? You don't.
For sure. That was the point. The point I was getting to with Bonds was, if a Bonds or Clemens got elected, I'd be curious to see what the Hall of Fame turnout was among the Hall of Famers. If there was a year where, like, all of a sudden 30 people were sick that day.
Like the people actually attending dropped out.
People
Like,
might say, like, I'm not going to applaud Bonds coming to the Hall of Fame, which I do think,
that would be terrible.
I do think that there would be Hall of Famers who didn't show up.
Yeah. Yeah. Just like Johnny Bench probably wouldn't show up if Pete Rose ever really did get in, because he has been, said a million times, and they were teammates and whatnot, but that's his hard line. And that's okay. That's where he comes from. I get it. It's not for me to agree or not agree. That's where he's at.
Yeah.
So, hopefully next year will be a little easier, getting some of these guys off there, but I don't think it gets easy anymore with this. I was going to ask you about the whole salary cap thing, but I think that's a whole nother podcast that I don't want to get into because of what happened recently with Tucker and the Dodgers and heading towards a labor stoppage. So here's what I'll hope, that our conversation that we have next January won't be solely about the Hall of Fame being the only baseball that's going to be played for the next year.
That's right. Which is, it's always posturing around this time of the cycle, but man, I'm scared. I do think there's a possibility that would be our outlook at this point in 2027. Could be bleak.
It's kind of funny because I think we're in a weird situation where I'm so excited for the season this year. The outlook for baseball, the sport, is great. I'm excited, even with all the Dodger stuff. But I look at the Hall of Fame, and I think that even though we might have a bleak baseball outlook, we should have a very good, interesting Hall of Fame discussion next year, because I think the ballot is the most interesting it's been in a long while, because you don't have this like weird consternation over the guys on it. And outside of Posey, there's a lot of different guys you can make an argument for. So we might see somebody shoot up that we didn't expect, which I think is a much more interesting statement. Like, okay, we know one guy's gonna get in, and that's probably it.
Yeah, I mean, Posey's interesting because he's, I mean, I think I would vote for him, but there are catchers like, Jorge Posada's a guy that didn't get a lot of support. Posada's numbers stack up pretty well against Posey's. And if you're going to count World Series rings as a factor, which I do with Posey, say same thing for Posada.
Yeah. Yogi Berra went a long way catching for all those Yankee championship teams. That made him a slam dunk candidate, not, well beyond his just statistics. You catch for a world champion for 10 seasons, you're probably a Hall of Fame player.
Probably a Hall of Fame player. Yeah.
So, all right, Dan. Well, thank you. I will let you go here because I have so many other things that I'd love to talk to you about. Maybe we'll do that another time, because I think I'm interested from your perspective, and I think Gordon is too. We're going to talk about salary cap in the future, and maybe it's something we could talk about, because I think it's been a non-starter for the Players Association, and I have kind of come around a little bit. I've been very defensive of the players' position, and to think, that you can't make that a no-pass zone, because you're never going to get anywhere if you don't say, well, what could we do with that? I don't want to get into it here because it's a conversation in itself. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Check out Dan's stuff in the Athletic. We read every day. We're lucky to have you join us, and look forward to having you again.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.